It's April 2024, and one of the most prestigious tournaments has started in Toronto, Canada, the FIDE Candidates, where among 8 of the most strongest chess players will be fighting between each other to get the first place in order to qualify on the final match against the current world champion, Ding Liren. It's the first round of the tournament, and 2 Indian rising stars have played between each other, as White plays Gukesh, which is famous with his fighting spirit and a good opening preparation, Super Grandmaster from India, and as Black plays Vidit Santosh Gujarati, which actually has a nickname of Vidit 2.0, which means that he typically starts the tournaments quite badly but performs extremely well at the end of the event, Super Grandmaster, an extremely talented player. The reason why 2 countrymates are playing between each other is to avoid some controversies at the end of the tournament. So if they will be playing on the final match, let's say on the 14th game, because they play a double round robin system, there might be some misunderstandings about the results, especially if one of them can get qualified for the World Championship match. Anyways, Gukesh starts with the d4, d5, c4, e6. So we got Queen's Gambit decline variation, because after knight c3, here instead of Black accepting the pawn sacrifice on c4, he goes with c5. This is a Taurus defense, which is not so common among elite players nowadays, but it has a good status of playing for active players and you can get a lot of counterplay in the center. Oh, one more thing, I will mention that they have 2 hours each. They don't have any increment when they make a move, not the 30 seconds increment, but after they reach 40 moves, they get additional 30 minutes plus 30 seconds after the move 41. So after c5, White plays e3, knight f6, knight f3, and after developing the pieces, White responds with a3. This move is so common because White wants to take the pawn on c5, and after bishop takes c5 to play b4 later. So White is gaining a tempo on the bishop on c5. Without a3, as you can see here, it is very symmetrical. None of the side wants to capture the pawns first. If White takes it, the bishop gets developed in 1 move instead of 2. So White wants to wait until Black plays something like bishop e7, then take on c5, and then bishop c5. Because in these cases, bishop is wasting 2 tempi to get to the final destination. The same rule applies as Black, so if Black will be taking on c4, then I want the bishop to get activated in 1 move. So after a3, White already prepares d takes c5 followed by b4 later on, and Black responds with a6. Because White has an extra tempo, d takes c5 makes more sense, and after bishop takes back, here comes b4. Takes the bishop, goes there, and rook a2. This is a bit strange looking move. Typically, White develops the bishop on b2, later on bishop e2, short castle, potentially queen b3, rook c1, and rook d1. This is typically how White wants to set up the pieces. But on the other hand, if White can maintain more pressure into the d5 pawn, it will be better. So that's why Gukesh plays rook a2 to maneuver the rook on d2, directly attack the pawn on d5, and then develop the bishop on b2. This rook on d2 will not be misplaced at all. One more detail I'll mention, that c takes d5 doesn't really look that great, because after pawn takes, knight takes back. If the queen will be recapturing, there is bishop b4, and White loses the queen on spot. So let's go backwards. After rook a2, White wants to maneuver the rook on d2 first, knight e5, tries to simplify the position as soon as possible, and rook comes to d2. c4 pawn is not under attack due to the pain of this pin along the d-file, so knight f3, g takes, and short castle. Again, the pawn on d5 is hanging, but White doesn't pay attention to that much, develops the bishop on b2. You might be surprised why, because c takes d5 looks quite tempting. What might be the issue? If Black recaptures back, that is true, that White will have a good control over the center, plus the bishop will be gone in short order. But the main problem is that Black plays e5, and because White hasn't finished the development yet, Black can't sacrifice the pawn, the king is quite vulnerable, next might be bishop d7, queen e7, potentially a5 as well, and well, Black gets more than enough compensation for material deficit. Therefore here, if we go back, instead of c takes d5, White responds with bishop b2, c4 pawn is not under attack, but here Black responds with a5. If not a5 and Black plays some slow looking moves, then c takes d5 might be a real threat, because this bishop is getting stuck on c8 as well. So let's say if in the previous move right now we mentioned about c takes d5 and black was playing e5, the bishop can get developed in one go. But here after bishop b2, if black wastes time for the move like bishop d7, then it will be very difficult to pull something off, especially if you're wasting one extra tempo. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe the channel, because whenever we reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway video courses from my website. So after bishop b2, a5, logical move, directly attacking on the queen side and using the fact that white hasn't finished the development yet. After that, c takes d5 and black responds with e5. Taking on d5, as we already mentioned, will be a complete disaster, but here white has some problems to fix. If white already has bishop on e2, short castle, and the king would be safe, no problem, it's just an extra pawn. But because of black's good activity on the queen side, it's not so simple for white to handle the pressure. Knight b5 was played, attacks the bishop, a takes b4, knight d6, queen takes d6. Logical approach, because when the pawn is under attack, the moves such as b5 might be okay on the first glance, but it creates a lot of weaknesses. So black can play bishop d7, later on queen e7, maintaining pressure on this pawn, rook comes to c8, potentially doubling it up, and white is not ready for this counterplay on the queen side. Therefore, Gukesh pulled the trigger and went for knight b5 immediately to grab the bishop on d6, which I believe is quite practical decision. If we will look at their time situation, I don't think any of the players were in the opening preparation, because they thought around 40 minutes each of them, which is not a good sign, especially in the first 14 moves. So after a takes b4, knight d6, queen d6, pawn takes back, and black takes on b4. So right here, it's a critical moment. If white takes the pawn on e5, it will be a complete disaster, because black has an amazing move, such as knight e4. Attacks the rook, it's pinned, so white has to take it, there is no other real option. But here comes queen e4. The bishop is under attack and the rook at the same time. Plus, if the king remains in the center, black has a lot of counterplay. The only move what computer suggests right here is bishop takes g7. Black doesn't want to take it back, because black will just be down a pawn, and plus the position looks quite bad. So queen h1 makes more sense. And here, surprisingly, Engine is recommending queen to h5. So it's really Engine kind of type of position, using the fact that rook a1 doesn't work because the bishop is controlling everything, preventing bishop h3 ideas, and in case of king g7, it's just perpetual checks, and it says that it's going to be a draw at the end. But there is another important variation here, what you need to remember, that let's say after bishop g7, queen h1, bishop f8 looks quite tempting, but it loses to bishop h3. And white has some serious issues connected to the bishop. If king e2, there is bishop g4, and black wins the game on spot. So let's go backwards. Anyways, bishop e5 was not played, but it's a brilliant calculation from Vidit, because he spotted this knight e4 and all the complications what was coming later on. So after queen b4, white plays queen c2, preventing this any kind of business of playing knight e4 and trying to play more or less solidly. Here, Vidit played quite strange looking move, which Engine says that it basically gave away the advantage what black already had at this point, and black forced the matters and made a draw. But instead of this move, which is actually bishop g4, quite surprising, develops the bishop quickly to attack the pawn on f3 and immediately tries to finish the development, since the king is in the center and requires 2 moves to make the castle. This kind of sacrifices might be quite valid. So let's go back. So after queen b4, queen e2, instead of bishop g4, which looks quite cool, but it's very flashy move, but not the best. The best move would have been rook e8. Black wants to play the moves such as e4 later on, and potentially bringing the bishop on f5 later, but it's not so easy to understand, because here Engine is saying about bishop c3, the queen comes to h4, and there might be a complete mayhem on the board. So when it plays bishop g4, the idea is that if the pawn takes, which actually is not a great plan for white, here comes rook c8, attacks the queen. Queen has to go somewhere. There are several options available. Let's say b1. But the biggest problem is that knight e4 is coming. And this rook is under attack, plus these rooks are lasering down the first and second rank, and it's not gonna work out well for white. So probably after rook c8, the best move would have been queen d3, but after knight e4 and then taking on d2, rook a2 is in the air, white can't survive any longer. So instead of taking the bishop, white plays bishop c3. There is not enough time to develop the bishop on e2, because black is doing exactly the same stuff, but the bishop is still alive on g4, so plays rook c8, attacks the queen, and tries to create a counterplay later on. I don't believe that the same kind of position, especially if we consider the fact that black still has the bishop alive, that it's a bad version by any means. So here, Gukesh already realized that after bishop g4 he is getting worse, so it was time to force the matters, and he plays bishop to c3. Well, attacks the queen and most importantly covers this diagonal, so if f takes g4, knight e4 will not be a case anymore. When black responds with queen a3, here comes bishop b2. Taking the bishop on g4 is not a great option because here is rook c8. The bishop is under attack and it's not so clear what white does to keep it protected. In case of rook d3, which looks okay normally in the beginning, but there is e4. And when the rook leaves, the bishop is gone. Well, they just repeated the moves. Bishop comes on b2, attacks the queen. Queen b4, again, if f takes g4, there is knight e4 coming. And after a couple of moves, they agreed on a draw by threefold repetition. This is the bonus question. Can you spot the right move for white? Let me know down in the comment section below.